It's damn well near the end of June. We're near the Stanley Cup Finals coming to an end as we approach Game 7 later on next week. And at this time, we are talking about the Boston Bruins and the Toronto Maple Leafs because we had ourselves some comments made by Boston goaltender Linus Ullmark on the recent edition of the Leafs Nation podcast, which was posted onto YouTube. This is the latest episode from June 21st, Marner extension featuring Linus Ullmark. Now this is, of course, going to get some really big eyeballs on it. A Toronto Maple Leafs-centered podcast with Linus Ullmark, the goalie of the Boston Bruins, or one of them, involved as a guest speaker. And with this in mind, the goaltender that was a part of the Toronto Maple Leafs eliminating Boston Bruins squad in 23-24's playoffs went out there and had some very intriguing comments as to his thoughts on the way the Leafs managed their crease. Let's go out there and read this article from the Hockey News, published by Evan Dorfler, because it goes out there and transcribes some of these comments made by Linus Ullmark. Essentially, the article opens up by talking about how, in an interview on Friday's episode of the podcast, the two hosts, Nick Alberga and Carter Hutton, spoke with Boston's Linus Ullmark to reflect on the playoff series against the Leafs and the decisions made between the pipes. As the series progressed, Ullmark found himself puzzled by the Leafs' commitment to stick with Ilya Samsonov as their starting goaltender. I was surprised that they kept Ilya Samsonov in for that many games against us in the playoffs. I felt that every time we played the Leafs and Joseph Woll was in the net, I felt that it was more of a challenge, even though I'm not a player. Just watching Woll, it looked like he was so much more in control of the situation that was thrown at him. Now that comment, of course, isn't the biggest deal in the world. He's not really calling anybody out or throwing anybody under the bus, but it is an interesting comment because these are the same sentiments that I think a lot of Toronto Maple Leafs fans and media had heading into these extra games against the Boston Bruins. That Sammy, for all intents and purposes, was the number 2. Joseph Woll was the guy that was better. The team played better in front of him, he was making more clutch saves, and Ilya Samsonov, to his credit, did have a pretty good Game 7 up until, of course, the end. But there were many warts in Ilya Samsonov's game. It doesn't take a genius to go out there and acknowledge the differences when you're watching the games as a fan, but to hear the opposing goaltender, the goaltender for the Boston Bruins, mind you, go out there and say the same thing, it does kind of raise some eyebrows as to how Sheldon Keefe was running this team in the postseason. The fact is, we can have analysts, fans, and media, all we want, go out there and say, Woll should have been the guy. Why did they start Samsonov? Samsonov sucks. Samsonov this. Samsonov that. But to have the opposing team's goaltender say it too, that's huge. Samsonov, this article goes out there and writes he had played games 1, 2, 3, and parts of 4 before he was pulled after allowing 3 goals on 17 shots. He then returned for Game 7 after an injury-plagued Joseph Woll, stopping 30 of 32 shots he had faced. For the playoffs as a whole, Samsonov had a 1-3-1 record with a .301 goals against average and an .896 save percentage. Ay, that's really not good. As Linus Ullmark mentions, inconsistent play can create chaos and uncertainty for the players in front of you. And that is something that I think goes under the radar a little bit when you talk about goaltending and changes in net. If you have a goaltender that just cannot make that extra save, he gives up a few bad rebounds here and there, his positioning is kind of off every few shifts. When you have that guy who is supposed to be your last man standing, your final wall, your final line of defense, it becomes a lot easier to see when the team in front of him notices that. And when the team in front of him starts to play worse, when they start to be a little bit more hasty, when they grip their sticks a little bit tighter, it's a lot easier to see when a team is playing in front of a goalie they're confident in versus a goalie they are not confident in whatsoever. And for Ilya Samsonov, you can tell that for parts of the regular season and in the playoffs, he just did not inspire much hope at all for the Toronto Maple Leafs forwards and defenders in front of him. Ullmark went out there and expanded on this idea too, As a goalie, and the players as well, they feed off of these things. If they see a guy that's flopping around a little bit too much or leaving crazy rebounds, feeling that you always have to struggle with it, then you get a little bit more on edge compared to if you have a goaltender that contains the puck or puts pucks in areas that are not a threat. Now, this article goes out there and explains that Linus Ullmark was in a pretty similar situation to Samsonov because he himself wasn't really all too great and he got eventually put in the back seat to Jeremy Swayman, but that of course is just kind of the tail of the tape when you talk about a team that has two fantastic goaltenders. You ride the hands, you go back and forth for as long as both of them are good, but once one of them decides to show signs of rust a little bit here and there, they start to give up a few extra chances that you normally wouldn't expect them to. That's when you change it up, and that's when you go consistent. They were going 1-2, 1-2, Ullmark, Swayman, since February. But then in the postseason, that's when they said, okay, sorry, Ullmark, you're taking a back seat. It's going to be Swayman's crease from here on out, and that was the plan. Ullmark does go out there and finish off this interview by talking about some things about Joseph Woll. He's just like every young goaltender nowadays. He's just so technically sound. I think the only thing that might stop him is the mental game. We all know it doesn't just happen overnight. It all comes down to experience. But again, Woll has come a long way in a short amount of time. I think he looks terrific. That's my honest opinion. He looks like a really good goaltender. So, when it comes to next season, the article then talks about whether or not Sammy or Woll or that tandem is actually going to come back, but we'll have to wait a little bit to see before that goes down. There were some people going out there and jokingly talking about the Linus Ullmark trade rumors, saying, hey, how is it that Linus Ullmark is able to go out there and talk about a Leafs player and kind of put him on the spot, whilst also being involved in a potential trade to the Toronto Maple Leafs? If he becomes teammates with the guy, then what? Like, there are a lot of people trolling about that kind of stuff. I don't really want to explore too much about the trade conversation and the potential of that just yet. I want to wait a little bit longer before free agency begins, and then we'll get into it. But for now, I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. How do you feel about Linus Ullmark speaking out against Ilya Samsonov? What are your thoughts about these comments where he says, yeah, he's surprised that Samsonov got the net as much as he had in that first round series against Boston? What does that say about Sheldon Keefe? What does that say about the way the Leafs handled themselves in front of these goaltenders and just the goaltenders' performances as a whole? Where does this leave Ilya Samsonov, and how do you see Joseph Woll projecting into the future? Also, big what if. What if Woll was just the number one guy the entire time? If you assume he was healthy the whole series, which he wasn't, but if you assume he was, what if he was just Woll, no Samsonov in sight? If that's the case, do the Toronto Maple Leafs beat the Boston Bruins? They finally beat that demon that has been haunting their dreams ever since the gosh darn 19 whatever it was decade when the Maple Leafs last beat the Bruins in the playoffs. It's been ages, and with all the years of trauma, the 2013s, the comebacks, the other years in the Matthews' era, it's been a tough go against this team. If it was just Woll the whole way through, would it have gotten done? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, if you wanted to talk about the idea of an Ullmark trade to Toronto, that I think is intriguing enough to discuss, but of course I want to wait a little bit before diving more into that. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about all these Boston and Toronto comments and notes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye.